Welcome to Team Futurism. Today I am interviewing Naum Milyavskiy, who is a writer based in Los Angeles, and he also writes the SUBSTACK, The Back Shop. His work often explores questions about emerging technologies, and this is Naum's third time, I believe, to be on Team Futurism. So Naum, welcome back.
Hey, thanks to be back. Love every time we meet for a conversation.
I kind of want to jump right into this topic of the new age of romanticism. You sent me this article by Ted Gioia, who wrote, "We really are entering a new age of romanticism." Go ahead and kind of like spell out what this is and maybe what his argument is. What is the new age of romanticism?
Yeah, so this article came out maybe on March 3rd, so like 11 days before we're sitting down today. And it's kind of a building on what Ted Gioia, is that, how do you say his last name?
I'm not sure. I'm guessing. I will put the article in the show notes, but it is Gioia. So there are multiple ways that could go. But he has like a big following. Apparently, he was a professor at Stanford, I believe. So whoever he is, I don't really know, but he has a following. Whoever he is.
Gotcha. I'll say Gioia. I'll say Gioia. Ted Gioia. Yeah. So his thesis in that article I sent you was basically that we're living through echoes of a moment of romanticism, the big movement of romanticism that occurred 200-ish years ago. And there were lots of parallels to draw between then and now. The biggest is we were living through the Industrial Revolution at the time, and there was a huge boon in technological advancement, whether it's like the steam engine or the telegraph, textile manufacturing. So essentially, a lot of manual work started to get automated, or I guess mechanized would have been the term they used back then. And while that was being developed, there was a counter kind of culture, a counter movement that rebelled against the machine and against mechanized labor and mechanized process and factory process. And there was a whole host of cultural values that were kind of rolled into that rebellion, including like a prioritization of imagination over reason, a kind of idealization of childhood and childhood innocence versus kind of like adult maturity and work and labor. There was a kind of return to nature. So not idealizing like the city as the peak kind of human achievement, but a kind of return to what Wordsworth, one of the poets, one of his famous places he used to go to was the Lake District in Britain. So kind of a return to nature, a rebellion against technology and mechanization, and a kind of reverence and new respect and idealization of imagination over reason.
So, I mean, one thing about this that actually it just struck me when you were talking and describing this is that I almost feel like this conversation is happening maybe like 50 years too soon or something like this, because I'm just kind of remembering that whenever futurists and like hardcore tech geeks talk about the future utopia that's coming when there's no work and robots run everything, this is almost how they describe it, is people hanging out at the lake and reading books and playing guitar, and there's no labor, and we all just like hang out and chill, and that's like utopia, and robots do everything, and we're filled with abundance, and hey, if we want to go and like hang out on some distant planet, oh hey, we can do that too. Robots just like made that possible for us. Is it possible that we're almost in terms of like this Ted Gioia guy, we're almost not thinking big enough, that maybe this is like we're just seeing the intro spawn of this, but maybe the tech people are onto the same wavelength, that they're just thinking, decades or centuries in the future? Or do you think that there is no parallel there?
That's a really good point. I think nothing is like a blanket reality about new romanticism or the kind of rise of AI and tech. So you're right that it's happening kind of in microcosms within tech itself. Like, what do you think Burning Man is? Burning Man's this kind of utopian experiment, and it's kind of a release valve for all of the controlled algorithmic life, right? Like you have
Mhm.
people in suits developing apps and kind of showing up to work in their 9 to 5s, and then they kind of let loose in the desert and become like radically different versions of themselves. So maybe there's like first of all, like a schizophrenic thing happening within tech of like extreme structure and extreme chaos. But more to your point, I think that a lot of the tech movement we're living through was actually conceived in the DNA of romanticism.
Hmm.
If you think back to Steve Jobs and the 60s and this era of free love and free exchange of information, that was like the hotbed of technology, and that's what kind of led us to the path we're on today. So I think that's almost like a more recent romantic swing. And then since the 60s, 70s, I think we've swung in the opposite direction. Though again, you're going to see nuances in it. So I think I agree with you. It's hard to kind of take a specific window and paint one reality.
Mhm.
And I do think tech has romantic elements embedded within it. Yeah, does that kind of
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, I think that there are kind of like two strains, maybe even three strains to this idea of new romanticism, if that's what the term is going to be. There's kind of like this strain where you're moving away from technology as a lifestyle, and then there's also more of the like the cultural spiritual element where you're no longer seeking any sort of like meaning or fulfillment or status from the online world. And they're almost like two separate things. I mean, like one is like economic and one is spiritual. I mean, people moving away from jobs that are online, right, would be like one version of this, and then the other version would be uh, uh, having your like romance and your friendships and everything based on solely offline. So there's kind of like a divide there, and then there's also the element that Ted really harps on is moving away from any sort of like algorithm controlling our lives at all. Um, I don't know. Is there a distinction there that you find interesting or that you want to hit on specifically?
between the kind of algorithmic domination and what was the first point you're
Well,
making?
I'm kind of thinking that, I mean, there are people who are trying to center their day-to-day lives for practical reasons and not have them tied to a screen. So not being
Mm,
a computer programmer, being a plumber, sort of thing. Like you're having your day-to-day life not be on a screen. There's also people who are trying to maybe still work on a screen, but they like still have their friendships and everything based offline for like
mm.
spiritual and cultural reasons. And so, I mean, you dropped this video for me of Ezra Klein recently having a conversation with someone, and he was talking about how like the Trump phenomenon almost is like this like tarot cardy based like spiritual type of movement, and it is like this like new age of, he didn't call it romanticism, but new age of like being associated with some sort of like a new sort of like spirituality that's emerging, and it might be kind of like part of this thing as well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the podcast you were talking about, yeah, I do forget the guest's name, but he was talking about how Trump represents this um, swing from the Obama era, and the Obama era was largely technocratic and kind of cool and reasoned and diplomatic, and now we're moving more into an era of um, mysticism is probably the word you're looking for, some kind
Oh,
of
that is the word he
mysticism.
used. Yeah,
Yeah,
mysticism.
where Trump, I believe Ezra Klein calls Trump some kind of grand Ayatollah of the conservatives, um, and that he has like a spirit of intuitive connection to ruling into this country that defies kind of like the classic um, like intellectual, really, the political intellectual that Obama sort of represented. So I mean, I don't know if we're jumping ahead, but I think that I clearly identify as a romantic, and I do see these early tendencies in my intellectual life and in college that we can talk about if we want. But at the same time, I recognize there's like a dangerous volatility to romantic thinking and the romantic value system, which is to prioritize like emotions over reason,
Mhm.
which Trump kind of epitophizes in a dark and problematic way.
Okay, so I'm still trying to like tie this all together because I think that there is a movement here happening, and
Yeah.
I have a little bit of a problem with the new romanticism idea, and I'm trying to like, you know, kind of stumble my way through understanding what my problem is with it exactly even. But so you are, maybe this is why you gravitate towards it, is you do gravitate towards the foundations of the classical romantic era, right? And
Yeah.
yeah, and like I do see that there is an emergence of that. And I mean, like clearly our culture is no longer just we're gonna be by the facts and we're gonna be by like hard nosed by the numbers, like the Obama thing. It is more just kind of, you know, fake news no
Intuitive.
longer even makes sense because like no one even cares whether the news is fake or not. Like it is just like we're feeling our way through everything. The
Yeah.
vibes matter more than anything else,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
But that seems to me like a bad thing. I mean, and I don't know exactly how that ties to people like moving offline or something, but like, does that tie together? Maybe we can tie a bow on your thoughts on that particular
Yeah.
question.
I
Is it tied together?
I think the piece about people moving offline is just so complicated to dissect because there are people who want to kind of shun technology altogether. Like the kind of homesteading movement is kind of one example of that. By the way, House on the Prairie got greenlit for a new kind of revamp, which speaks,
Saw that.
yeah, which
Yeah,
is kind of
Little House on
wild.
the Prairie. Yeah.
Yeah, Little House on the Prairie. But I think there's the kind of shunning of technology, and then there's the reappropriating technology to create a more, let's say, romantic connection to it. That's less kind of being a slave to an algorithm and more using it in an unruly experimental way. And I think those threads have kind of always existed side by side. Um, so I think your kind of rejection of the online and the digital is not quite capturing what romanticism means, because there's a lot of embrace of the digital, but it's not in the way that like um, there are different ways to embrace it, if that makes sense.
I mean, it does. I guess it is interesting because it's hard to try to wrap your mind around a new cultural phenomenon without trying to dissect the new right movements happening globally. It is so strange. I mean, because the new right is all about. I mean, supposedly, like it's hard to say what they're all about, but it is kind of like tapped into moving away from cities, having more kids, being more religious, kind of getting back to something. But
Mhm.
you don't necessarily talk to those types of people, and I know some actually, and you don't see them being like, oh, by the way, and also I'm deleting my Twitter account. Like you don't see that so much in this movement.
Mm.
Like they're like all in on social media, it seems like, as much as anybody, but
Well,
they do just want to ground themselves, I think, in almost just like the style of an old-fashioned way of living or something. Or is that just not fair? Is that too unfair?
no, I think you're right. I don't see abandoning technology as any response. There's no abandoning. I think getting off the grid means you're not in the conversation, which means you're not part of any movement. Like, you know what I mean? So I think it's just about how you use technology and your relation to it. And I think if you look at X and what's happened with Twitter/X, you could see a kind of like mob uprising, and Elon kind of symbolizing that as well.
Mhm.
In him like reducing constraints in speech, and just like all the platforms since Trump was inaugurated, like prioritizing speech and expression over careful moderation and modulated expression. So I think that's a romantic swing as well in the platforms. And that's what I mean. Like, I think it's all being lumped into this whole like kind of rise of Trump, and a lot of it feels very toxic.
Mhm.
And I think there are ways that like you can be on the side of the romantic mindset and worldview and not embrace these like toxic mob-like mentalities, although that is the kind of gutter in a way for romanticism, I think. Does that make sense?
You know what? Yeah, I mean, it does. And maybe one of the things that makes me question the new romanticism is that it does feel like such like an online thing. It seems like just another online thing that's gonna kind of come and go, which is also fine. I like live online and I like online things, so I'm totally okay with that. But
Right.
you know, one thing that was interesting about the Ted G, we'll call him just Ted G.
That's good. I like that.
His article is that he says like why we're really entering this new age. He doesn't actually say why, but like part of the subtext there, or maybe I mean, I didn't read the article too carefully. Sorry, Ted. Maybe I missed it. But he lists out all these people, even like big writers who have been writing about the same thing. And so one of the people he quoted was Ross Barkin, who's a fairly well-known writer, and he wrote about this new movement in The Guardian and also on his own Substack. I pulled a quote from him that I thought was interesting. He said, "Empiricism, algorithms, and smartphones are out. Astrology, art, and life live fiercely offline are in." Anybody, I think, would read that and just be like, yeah, like this is awesome. Like I love this. And yeah, that's me. But it almost seems like it's just kind of like people would associate with that as like a flex and then not actually do anything about it. Right. Or do you think that it's more than that? Do you think that I'm being too cynical about that?
I mean, I think like when you think about the romantics in the 1800s, like who was it that was actually like exhibiting these tendencies, right? Did it happen?
I wanted to ask about this. Yes, this is such a good question.
This is, I mean, we have such little time and such depth we're attempting, which is, I love this. It's like,
I mean, it's an empirical question too. Who were these people? Because this is actually my next point is I know who the people are who are talking about new romanticism. They're all middle-aged white guys.
Right. Well, so I guess if you go back to the industrial era, like, okay, you have here your classic, like kind of artists, poets who epitomized the movement. And I studied this as I studied literature in undergrad. Wordsworth, Blake, Percy Shelley, Keats, Coleridge. These were like white men. Not that like the race matters too much. Maybe the gender does a little bit. But I think what I was getting at was they were kind of an elite, right? Like they were able to write poetry and kind of a lot of them were poor and they couldn't sustain themselves. But the bottom line is like who kind of formed that movement, and did it happen from a groundswell or did it happen from like the top of this kind of elite chamber of society? So kind of speaks to your question about like, is your average person, even your average artist today, like, do they understand they're part of this conscious movement? I think some people orient themselves more consciously away from technology and kind of technocratic values, and other people just don't understand a frustration, but there's a frustration. Like, let's take your average social media user who doesn't even know who Mark Zuckerberg is, probably, but they're constantly being like affected by their Instagram and their Instagram feed, and it's changing on them, and their interface is changing, and they understand how that affects them psychologically. So I think there's that push, and that happens on the highest level of people who, let's say, Justine Bateman, she just launched a film festival called Credo, which is like an overt anti-AI film festival. I think she markets it as like the first film festival that exclusively like does not include AI. And so it happens. Yeah, it happens. Like, I think it happens at the individual level for average people on some level. And then it happens kind of at these more artistic kind of like creative extremes.
So I pulled the statistic. I thought that this was a little bit interesting because I do think that at some level, you know, not to be too cynical, but I did kind of notice, because I did go down the list of writers who are writing about this topic, and they all are middle-aged people who have been in the content game, as it's called, online for quite some time. And this is just kind of, it seems like to me, I'm not pushing back on like you're being cynical about the idea of this movement, by the way, because I also love it. You know, I do like the idea, and I want to talk about where I'm at with this like in a minute, maybe. But I'm super cynical about the people writing about this, including Ted G, because it's all just like a trendy thing to talk about. And who knows who cares about this versus who just wants their own like clicks. And this happens to be a trending topic. And it's just like, there's a layer of irony here that it's online people talking about being offline as a movement. It's just so delightfully ironic. So I looked it up, right? I looked it up. Are we moving offline? Like, no. And so like these writers love to talk about, oh, there's this movement in Brooklyn of teenagers who are like not having a cell phone, as if like this is some big, like huge thing. 2024, there was a study from Pew Research. 95% of US teens aged 13 to 17 report using social media, and nearly half of them report being online, quote, almost constantly. This is not like this is not like a mass abandonment of the internet or online culture. I mean, this is people who are aging out of it being as cool as it used to be online, and maybe they don't feel the urge or the the dopamine hit they used to when they were younger and they first got on Instagram or something like right. But like younger generations, they literally don't know anything else, and it's like, of course you're on all these platforms because like we drink water, right? I mean, like we eat food, right? Of course I'm on all these platforms. So I do think that it's one, this movement is a little bit as the movement we're reading about, right? It's like a classist thing. It's like an age bracket thing. And probably, 20 years from now, these 13-year-olds, they're going to have their own version of this and they're going to write about it, but not really do much about it. This is my ultra cynical take, to say nothing about the fact that I do actually like the idea of getting offline personally, but that's my cynical take. And that's what, like, brass tacks, no one actually is getting offline by the numbers, I think.
Yeah. Well, I just want to like add some complications to that, because I think it's not a sheer binary of like, are you plugged in, are you online or not? It's kind of what I was saying earlier about Substack rising. Like a lot of these writers are on Substack or have their kind of independent platforms, which is a type of digital like expressionism that's contrast to like big institutional names like the New York Times or the Washington Post or like name any big journalistic outlet. So that's the kind of binary that that's the kind of distinction I'm trying to make. So it's a more individualized internet. It's a more personal, more subjective kind of approach to online life. And I think kids have exhibited this through like the popularity of like Be Real. Do you remember when Be Real became a thing where like
I might have missed Be Real.
It's kind of like there's the curated Instagram, there's the polish of Instagram and TikTok as people have curated their feeds and their content. And then there's this app that just pings you to like show yourself, however you're looking and just be as authentic as possible.
Oh, okay. I like that.
Yeah. And I would argue that this value of authenticity that I'm hearing everywhere in the content creation space is symptomatic of a new romanticism, where it's like, we don't want you to see you at your prettiest. We want to see you at your realest. And if you're real through and through on your platform, you're going to get some kind of engagement in return. That's the real thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was listening to a podcast, Barry Weiss's Honestly today, and she was interviewing some woman who was very high up in Facebook. And apparently just today, she dropped some bombshell book about Facebook, like the inside story about how they're a bad company and bad people, kind of obviously. But one thing that this lady said that was fascinating to me was that she used to, for fun, go into Instagram and go back in people's history. And you can tell the minute they decided to like go pro with their Instagram, because it goes from being like fun and here's a picture of me like hanging out with my friends and here's a picture of my food, or oh, I like this sunset or whatever, to just like ultra like professional looking, and you spent so much time editing this and et cetera, et cetera. And the fact that, I mean, I've never done that, but the fact that you can do that and like be entertained and be like obviously notice when someone makes that shift, it's pretty funny. And I think that everybody looks at that as being just kind of like, just gross. I mean, like, I don't know, like being authentic is always good. It's never not good to be authentic, I think, right?
I don't think anyone is going to admit that they like inauthenticity, but there could be a premium on it. I don't think people are going to be like,
Good
I
point.
want photoshopped and like airbrushed whatever, like, you know, but I think they're going to gravitate toward it and like condone it and support, like basically they vote with their like, and like if that does well, if it performs well on social media, that's what people are looking for and want and reward. So I think that is
Can
still
I
being rewarded, but I think there's a counterculture to it as well.
This is a bit of a tangent, but I have
Sure.
to share this because this
Yeah.
was so interesting to me. You know, Joseph Gordon-Levitt.
Yeah.
So he's on Substack,
Okay.
and I actually recommend following him because he does this very well. And maybe it's very calculated. I'm sure it is. Everything's calculated, but he does this authenticity thing very well. And one of his videos, it was an essay that he read recently, was so good. And it actually was about the specific point. It was about why was Nirvana the best band ever? Why did they hit so hard and continue to hit so hard? And he parallels it with this band, the Meat Puppets, where Nirvana played some of their tunes as like they covered some of their tunes. And the Meat Puppets tunes, I think it was Meat Puppets. I think that's who he was talking about. It was very raw and very weird and just not like totally as catchy as it could have been until Kurt Cobain did the covers of their songs. And Kurt Cobain made it like less bizarre, less strange, less, he just, you know, kind of like polished the edges a little bit, but it was still very weird and very authentic. And right. Joseph Gordon-Levitt made this point that I thought that was so fascinating, is that if you want to be a great artist, not a good artist, but a great artist, is be completely weird and completely authentic, but then pull back and just polish the edges a little bit. And don't be the Meat Puppets, be Kurt Cobain. That to me was just so fascinating, is be completely weird, but just polish it off just a little bit. Not too much, just a little bit. That to me, I've never thought about it in that way, was kind of brilliant, I thought.
Yeah, and like to bring it back to our conversation, like it's not like people are posting without, like they're not unconsciously posting where they look ugly. They're just leading into the blemish and the flaws a bit more than they would have in an era of perfection and like looking to make everything look polished. So yeah, to your point, like there's still an aesthetic, and aesthetic requires some level of curation. So people do curate their Instagram feeds still, but now they're, and by, you know, I'm not saying everyone does this, but yeah, now with like a more, let's say, romantic aesthetic that embraces flaws or subjectivity, we might get rougher edges and like it. Yeah, it's kind of like when you get the best, most like the best resolution and the sharpest crystal clarity in film and video, and then suddenly there's something appealing about the film stock that has the blemishes, that has the film grain, that has the distortion, and you're like, that's actually truer and somehow more appealing than something that can like just be like crystal clear.
I saw somebody say this recently about, also on Substack, my new platform of preference, but we were talking about Otessa Moshfegh's films and how like Eileen, based on her book, just wasn't a good film. Just, it was okay, you know, just was not great. And someone in the comments said that if this were made in the 70s, like same script, but just like different director and like more of that like 70s aesthetic, it would have been a great film, but like we just don't have the availability of that aesthetic anymore. And that pacing, you know, to really like harness whatever was happening just like in the water in the 70s. I thought that was so true. And it kind of made me feel like we should lean into what's working now, just like they leaned into what was working in the 70s. And we'll just know 20 years from now what really worked or not. But I have a thing that part of being authentic is trying to be current, because otherwise you're trying to be something that's not happening today. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about that in terms of like, even if you make a less good film, I would say, like, even if you make the Eileen of today, that's not a good film, that's still the movie you should maybe make or something. I don't know, but you're a filmmaker, so I'm curious to your thoughts on that.
I mean, I want to quote Bowie here, but I don't want to like mess up the quote. He says something about it's dangerous for an artist to try and please people. and that's kind of the death of the artist. So I think the ideal situation would be like just imbibing the atmosphere and unconsciously almost creating art that leans into movements in your time. Like you're
Okay,
almost
I
not even
love that.
aware of it.
You said a
Right?
thought that I've had a million times, but I've never actually said. Yes, that's great. Lean into art that is associated with movements happening today in your time. I think that that's brilliant.
Right. But you're never gonna like imagine, like maybe your thing is polished, reason-based, like emotionless art. I don't know. Like romanticism is synonymous with art to me, but let's say you're not in vogue, in step with what's happening now. I don't think, yeah, there's no way you should pivot like to what's going on. Like do you, right? And hopefully you're like aligning. The thing is, I think if you're, like you said, drinking the water of our time and you're an artist living and breathing, your art can't help but emulate what's happening. Like it's like you're not an artist if you're not absorbing and reflecting back like to people what's going on. So I would just say those people aren't really artists, they're hacks, because they're like not actually paying attention to what's in the air and what's in the atmosphere and emotional kind of valence of the time. But I wanted to run one thing by you because I know we're running low on time. Remember when we talked about the new sincerity and David Foster Wallace? Does that ring a bell to you at all?
I wouldn't be able to regurgitate what the new sincerity is, but
right.
I do remember talking about it.
It's kind of like this, you know, you have postmodernism that's kind of ironic and satirical, and everything's ironic, nothing's taken seriously. And then you have David Foster Wallace kind of advocating for the opposite, which is like, why don't we take things at face value and be authentic and sincere? And I really love this idea of the new sincerity. And I think there's a lot of overlap between new sincerity and like romanticism. So like, about like a year and a half ago, I just sat down and made a list of binaries that capture this like new push in a new direction. I called it like the great sincerity, but I just want to run these binaries by you and see if they like make you feel any type of way. So we have transparency versus obfuscation. So transparency is going to be the new romantic thing. Optimism versus cynicism. Cooperation versus competition. Qualitative over quantitative. Spirituality versus materialism. Romantic versus rational. Agency versus passivity. Lateral versus top down. Peer-to-peer versus boss to employee. Expansive versus restrictive. Open versus closed. Accessible versus esoteric. Intrinsic versus extrinsic. Regenerative versus extractive. Holistic versus analytic. Intentional versus reactionary. Spontaneous versus determined. Yeah, something like that.
I have a lot of thoughts on that. Yeah, can I tell you the first thought that springs to mind?
Yeah, of course.
I mean, one, I do love this, and I think that this fits in so neatly to what we've talked about in the past, also about like metamodernism, how it's an oscillation between modernism and sincerity and postmodernism and irony. You oscillate between the two, and you kind of like fit them into the same work. So with my literary journal Jokes Review, we've been taking submissions for a meta modern issue. And so it's going to be published in a couple of months, and I'm really proud of it. It's going to be like, I think, our best issue. And one thing that I've discovered, kind of like putting this issue together, is that we requested submissions about metamodernism, and I don't think that like it totally works to have a collection of pieces that are all doing this like balancing act. Oh, it's partly, ironic, but also partly sincere, and it like oscillates between the two. Part of like the beauty of a project like this is having some really stark contrasts. So having a piece that is quite very heavily ironic juxtaposed with a piece that's very quite heavily sincere. And I think that you have to like experience both extremes to have your mind be able to oscillate between the two in a productive way, rather than shoving it into one particular work. And so when I look at a bookshelf, I'm looking at my bookshelf right now, I can pick out works that are completely over the top, like postmodern, and just like you will not find a sincere word in the whole book. And at the same time, I can look at like The Cathedral by Raymond Carver. Completely 100% sincere. The dude cannot write an ironic word to save his life. He just can't.
Yeah.
And I might, as a reader, want to read one super postmodern book and then Cathedral. And I just had a meta modern experience reading those back to back. Like my mind finds that happy place. And so I think that even if like a work doesn't shove these two into the same thing, I think that like as a consumer and also as a time in life when all these books are available to us, it's almost impossible to not have a sort of meta modern oscillating perspective on the world because we're surrounded by extreme works on either end, and our minds do just kind of like marry them. That's my first thought. That was a little long-winded, but that's my first thought about seeing, you know, that those terms that have us like a stark contrast.
Yeah, I think to bring it back to like the kind of romanticism we're talking about, I think you're a good rejoinder to the romantic push is like, well, don't we still need reason? Like, what about the other side?
Right.
And like, we still want like intellectuals, we still want reasoned debate. So I think, I don't know, maybe there's like some grand moral lesson here about like not oscillating at all. And we don't like, hopefully, we don't have romantic movements that need to push back against technology. But then maybe there's also a lesson about how humanity will sort of like ratchet certain mentalities and technologies until it becomes like overbearing, and then we need to like basically revolt. So I mean, I think the difference between us in like based on our past conversations, like I'll kind of defend a Jordan Peterson and you'll defend a Richard Dawkins, and I think those really are the clashing worldviews. And I think it's not like I want to throw away science and you want to throw away mysticism,
symbolism, and
symbolism and meaning and kind of cryptic, kind of different ways of understanding things. So I don't know. It's about fusing the two.
Yeah, you know what's so interesting about that, and I think that this is an important point, is that even though you oftentimes will kind of like side with Richard Dawkins you will side with Jordan Peterson and I'll side more with Richard Dawkins on any given particular issue that they're discussing, I still like genuinely almost all the time fully understand where Peterson is coming from. And I think that you kind of like fully understand where Dawkins is coming from. And so I'm not saying like Peterson is wrong or anything like that. I'm just saying more of like, on a practical application, I'm probably going to say, let's go with Dawkins on this practical application of this particular topic. But, you know, I think that we're in a culture right now that just so badly wants to be like, Jordan Peterson is an idiot, or Richard Dawkins is an atheist moron, and they're destroying the culture. That's where I think that you and I like have a healthy perspective on this, because we're not, either of us are saying that. We're just kind of like, maybe we'll apply their, you know, quote unquote wisdom at different times in different places and in different increments. But I mean, that also is kind of like a meta modern-ish way of going about.
I think what you're saying is that we understand nuance.
Yes.
Which is completely lost in social media, like movements and just big sweeping, like populist things that happen in our country. You know what I mean? Like, but you know, I will say in response to that, I think that you might intuitively want to side with Dawkins in places where I might intuitively want to side with Peterson. So, and maybe that might not be true, but based on conversations, I think like there is a general temperament and kind of positionality we both have, and I think we're both invested in. I don't think we see eye to eye on everything, and I think there are fault lines for us where I'm going to be like, it's more important to explore the meaning than the truth value. And I think you might be like, well, I'm still hung up on the truth value because I think that's the actionable thing. And I'm going to be like, well, I want, you know what I mean? So I think there's still meaningful differences between us where we kind of will draw the line.
Oh, totally. Yeah. And get me in the right mood, and I actually will side more on the symbolist line of that ledger. I totally will sometimes, but yeah, you're probably right. I think that is a divide between us. The one last topic that I just want to like run by you, that as I was preparing for this conversation, I just took some notes about why algorithms might be good, actually, because our friend Ted G, just to circle back to him, he is really, really, really hard against algorithms. And he makes the argument that the the old classic romanticism movement was a response against algorithms of that time, and this one is too. Like, we like down with the algorithm, man, you know, like that has that energy for sure.
Right.
I want to do just like a little teeny bit of a defense, maybe to make it fun. I'll do a very big full-throated defense of algorithms. As a content creator, which we all are, man, if you're like putting out some content in the world and like the algorithm picks it up, it's like the coolest thing. It's like the best thing. It feels like God reached down from the sky and like selected you and like said, you're the winner today. Like, you just won the lottery ticket. Because it's interesting. I mean, one, the algorithm is like kind of sort of depends on the platform, but I mean, like, it's not arbitrary at all, right? Like, it sees when you did all the things right, and it sees when it's getting some organic groundswell, and then it will like boost it higher and higher in masses. And so like, if you get an article or a video, this happens to me on YouTube and also Substack sometimes, not that often, but like, you get like one article, and then like after maybe 10 minutes, it's gotten like 20 likes or whatever. It's like, whoa, here you go. And like, here's a couple hundred likes now, you know what I mean? Because it's the algorithm is like, oh, we got this. And the thing about that is that when it has happened to me, it's happened to like content that totally fucking deserved it. It hasn't happened to something I'm like, oh, I'm so embarrassed I wrote that. Like, oh God, don't let people see this. It's like, that's the good shit. And like, somehow the algorithm was smart enough to know that this is what the community is gonna like. It's like literally give the people what they want. That's what the algorithm is doing. And also, I just want to say, like, as a consumer, taking myself out of the, like, the content creator world, as a consumer, nothing is more frustrating than when I'm on an app and it's feeding me ads and content that has nothing to do with who I am. It's like, what are you doing? Like, get this away from me. I want like content that I want, you know, I want the ads that I'm actually going to click on, and I want the people I'm actually going to read. Like, give that to me. That's what I'm here for. And I think that partly algorithms just aren't quite honed in enough yet. But if all of us, content creators aside, if all of us as consumers hopped online and immediately got what we were looking for, it would be like the best thing ever. It would be like walking into a restaurant and the waiter automatically hands you the best meal you've ever had. If you're walking into a bookstore and they automatically give you the best book you've ever read, or you walk into a movie theater and they automatically start playing the best film you've ever had, and just the one you exactly want to see at that exact moment in time.
Yeah, can I just...
This could be amazing. I'm just saying, we may just not be there yet because we're still working this sort of dumb algorithms. Okay, what do you say to that?
Well, so I think it's the ethic that's created from the sense of success that algorithms have had. It almost becomes a hubris that if only we come up with the best algorithm, we can fix X, Y, and Z. So I agree with you that like the idea of the algorithm was to serve the people what they want. What's more populist than that? What's more appealing to all people? Like, but then there's a level at which the algorithm becomes the final word, and the algorithm is so ambitious in trying to align us and like drip feed our interests to us individually that we start to feel like there's no organic chaos, there's no life, and there's no squishiness that kind of leads to chance encounters. Like, it's too controlled. Like, you might want everything you want at every second of the day. You go into the theater, exact movie you want, exact song you want. But then what about those moments where like you're unsure? And then something comes up by chance that wasn't curated for you, and you start to feel some kind of connection to it. And you appreciate the odds that they were small and something landed in your lap that wasn't curated for your eyes and wasn't like laser beamed down from above by like the all-knowing algorithm. I think what people are craving is a pushback from the control and the kind of determinism that algorithms represent. And that's a natural adjustment from algorithms having so much power and becoming so good that we then crave something else. So to go back to Ross Barkan,
if I could dial back my.
Well, let me just finish.
For sure.
So Ross Barkan, his quote from that article you quoted, and I pulled this, was, "Backlash is bubbling against tech's dominance of everyday life, particularly the godlike algorithms. Their true calculus, still proprietary, the rule of all digital existence. It goes from being a benevolent entity that's serving you up things you like to being a dictatorial thing that tells you what you should like. It doesn't allow room for anything else."
Yeah, no, I do like that a lot. Although I do think we're going to enter a world where algorithms just get better at feeding us what we want. And it may not be as bad or scary as we think, in the sense that like our brains are kind of machines and they just want stuff. And like getting stuff we want is what our brains are designed to seek out. I mean, one practical example of this. Oh, well, I do want to dial it back just a little bit and say that, like, I think that in terms of the scariness of this, maybe we will gravitate towards a world, and we're creating the world, and we can mess with this stuff, right? So like we might want the algorithm to be perfectly synced with our desires and needs, even if those desires and needs include wanting to have a little bit of like seeming chaos in the world in certain domains, but not in others. So I truly want my YouTube ads to just be good. Like, please, dear God, let's make them good. Like, you know what I mean? Or my Instagram ads, I want to click on them. Like, give them to me. Like, I want to, like, let's have it. You know, I want no more bad ads ever, and I want to pay for that. Even like, it's like I bought shoes and shit off of like those ads. I don't go ever shoe shopping, so let me see it so that I don't have to go looking. Okay. But like maybe in the art world, maybe I do want to like naturally stumble into more shit. So there's kind of that, but I'm fascinated by art that was created by committee and by algorithm, and it's just better than anything you could ever imagine. So there's like this Imogen Heap song called The Happy Song. It's a children's song, and she wrote it specifically to make children happy. And it's like the happiest song ever. It's like so good. It's so catchy and so fantastic. And literally when my daughter is crying, I'll just put that song on and she'll be like, you know, like she'll just start smiling.
This is a hard argument to rebut.
And I don't know. Like my daughter literally would have shed more tears in her 3 years of life if that song didn't exist. You know what I mean? And like,
well, let me tell you the difference though. Like, let's imagine every time your daughter cried, you played on an algorithmic song that would like soothe her back to feeling good again. After about 2 months, I don't know, hopefully sooner, you're going to be like, wait, there's actually like something good about her crying and expressing her emotions and not being soothed.
Oh, there's not. That's spoken like a guy who doesn't have She cries all the time. She has plenty of crying moments.
Yeah, maybe.
To be fair, I also play her like Donovan. There's a Donovan song that's so good. Honestly, it's catchier than Imogen Heap. It's the Mr. Wind. Oh God, it's so catchy. Like,
can I just throw in a quote? Like we didn't mention Neil Postman, who's like super influential. I wrote a thesis about him in college.
We should talk
about
him.
Can I just throw out a quote that I think applies in Technopoly with is the book I think Technocracy? No, Technocracy, right? Technopoly. Okay. He writes, the primary, if not the only goal of human labor and thought is efficiency. That technical calculation, this is the ethic for a technocracy or a technopoly, a state where technology rules. So the primary, if not the only goal of human labor and thought is efficiency. That technical calculation is in all respects superior to human judgment, that in fact human judgment cannot be trusted because it is plagued by laxity, ambiguity, and unnecessary complexity. that subjectivity is an obstacle to clear thinking, that what cannot be measured either does not exist or is of no value, and that the affairs of citizens are best guided and conducted by experts.
We probably do live in a technopoly, right? And that, I mean, the part of the human will that isn't captured in that quote is we also do rebel against everything. So, I mean, I'm sitting here partly rebelling against the premise of New Romanticism, but that's just because, like, I like to be, you know, I like to rebel against things.
Yes.
So yeah, we never probably will be fully technopolis because we always will have a rebellious streak in ourselves. There always will be those teenagers who throw away their phones, right? At some level.
Yeah, I think so. Have you read Aldous Huxley, The Brave New World?
Yeah, absolutely. Great book, and very apropos to this time.
Totally. And I think it's just
because it's like technology is like a drug that we're ingesting, and it's giving us the dopamine hit constantly, right? Which was the Brave New World. It's not like a scary bad world where, you know, like 1984. It's like, oh no, you're happy. You're very happy in Brave New World.
Yeah, and we're also both reading Neil Postman's Amusing Yourself to Death. And one of the final lines of the book is about how the most important thing that people lose in that Huxleyan world where everything's fed to them and they're happy is just to question like how they're happy and like what alternatives there are. Like it's the control is not even the most important thing. It's like, how is an original thought possible? Like we need to like have one layer of protection against everything that manipulates us and presses our buttons. Just one layer of self-reflection to break out of it. And I think
maybe one last thought that I will in my conversation with is this idea, and people say this all the time in the modern world, is that we probably all would be happier if we just lived on an island somewhere and raised goats. Even if there was no plumbing or electricity, there's so much like instant fulfillment in that, like working with your hands, getting up with the sun, raising your children. There's something probably more profoundly satisfying than that. And frankly, we've lost it. And maybe in this brave new world, we just can't fully turn back to that. But I think keeping an eye, looking over our shoulder and realizing that there's some there is probably healthy in the long run if we don't lose sight of that, right?
Hey, that's a good place to end it. Let's use our phones, but like with some judgment.
Yes, I think so. And hey, as we're doing this over some like crazy levels of technology that I can't even pretend to understand with microphones and lights and recordings. True. And it's good to have everything, but it's also, it is more fun to hang out in real life. No, I will say, like, because we were just hanging out, and it is more fun. Like, this is fun, but frankly, it's more fun to like walk down the street and get a coffee.
We had to use bathroom. We had to use the bathroom breaks. We had bodies to tend to. It was so uncomfortable. No, I'm just kidding. It was great. I love it.
I know. Yeah. Hey, well, thanks again for coming on. Anything that you're working on right now, or any new projects that you want to share?
Yeah, I'm working on a project about falconry that has taken on different forms, but I'm most likely going to release online actually as a YouTube series. So I'm kind of leaning into this new romanticism and trying to put something out there that's kind of aligns with it somehow. So that's the big thing that's coming out, and I'll keep you posted about it.
Awesome. Yeah, I've seen a little bit of that, at least an early stage of that, and I loved it. It's very fascinating and very thought-provoking. Is there any word on the project about a certain young comedian? Is that going to be dropping anytime soon, or are you not quite ready to talk about that yet?
Not quite ready. We're in post-production, and it's going to be released this year. It's going to go to festival, but we still don't have like a final title for it, so I don't want to be dropping names.
Okay, that sounds great. Well, looking forward to that too. I happen to have an inside scoop on another project, but that sounds great. All right, hey, thanks again for coming on, and let's keep in touch.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.